I am Bryce Johnson. I, like John, am a retired pastor. I served in the local church for 35 years in the United Methodist congregation, in the United Methodist Church. In my retirement, I make and bake bread at our home, and I sell it to the local farmers market. And I'll say more. You'll hear more about bread in just a few minutes. I've practiced centering prayer about 12 years. Jody and I joined a prayer group in Stillwater, not far from our home. It was the home of John and Lois Welshons, who were experienced practitioners and also wise spiritual elders. Sadly, John died just 2 years after we started with that group, but we have carried on, and except for a break during COVID, our group has met at Lois's home now ever since, two times a month. I'd like to say by now I have mastered the thing, but my mind easily wanders. There are some sits where my thoughts never end, but usually there is some brief moment when I am able to be still and know God, and I take comfort in the counsel of Cynthia Bourgeau, who says, a millisecond of union with God is enough for God to work in us. In recent years, I've attended 8 and 10-day intensive retreats, one learning about the false self and recognizing it's going to take me the rest of my days and more to dismantle my emotional programs for happiness, and the other experiencing the unloading of the unconscious. It wasn't pretty. My practice and understanding of the contemplative life has been shaped by James Finley, who teaches with the Center for Action and Contemplation, and his podcast, Turning to the Mystics, is a favorite of mine. A couple of quotes that I appreciate from him. He says, if on the count of 3 God snapped God's fingers and God's love disappeared, you would disappear. I would disappear. The universe would disappear. For the whole universe was created by and is sustained by the love of God. I would add, despite all the evidence to the contrary, James Finley believes love is at the heart of the universe. Another, when I breathe in and breathe out the love of God, I am liberated from the tyranny of all those things that try to name who I am. And I discover that love alone has the power to name who I am. I was attracted to centering prayer in large part because of the emphasis on silence. Because earlier in my adult life, silence was the gateway to several magical, mystical encounters with God. In my 30s, Jody and I were hiking in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. We had hiked through morning rain to reach our destination for the day and also for the night. It was a place called the Lake of the Clouds. And as we drew near to the Lake of the Clouds, the rain stopped, the clouds dispersed, and we were bathed in glorious sunlight. It was at that time that I looked around and I saw that everything was one. The rocks, the sky, the water, the creatures, the people. I saw it as clear as day, all was one. A second time occurred near the midpoint of my career. It was a time of transition. You might call it my midlife crisis. But it wasn't so much a crisis as a gnawing dissatisfaction with my life. I had done well in my work. I was much affirmed by the congregations where I'd served. But inside there was great discontent. Is this as good as it gets? Was I going to spend my remaining work years doing much the same as I already had? There must be something new, something bigger, something more that God has in mind for me. At the time, I was participating in a 2-year spiritual formation program. And the leaders of the group encouraged me to do some journaling around this. Imagine a different future. Dream big, because God's dreams for our lives are often bigger than our own. And so I did, and I sketched out several scenarios. I would become a nationally known preacher. I would become a renowned spiritual guru. I thought about applying my skills in the for-profit world. And then, as I journaled, a very different scenario emerged. Different and far less grandiose. In this scenario, I would leave parish ministry and become a bread baker. I was caught off guard, but intrigued because it was so different from the others. It wasn't as though this came out of the blue. I had been baking bread since I was in high school. I got a job in college because I could bake bread. I really enjoyed it. This 2-year program concluded with a 3-day silent retreat, not dissimilar to what we're doing this weekend. It was held at the Episcopal House of Prayer. Are you familiar with anybody been to the Episcopal House of Prayer? It's a beautiful place, beautiful setting adjacent to the St. John University campus. And at that retreat center, they have a standalone room called the Oratory, this beautiful circular space. And in the center is finely ground gravel, which then are in concentric circles. 3 times in that retreat, I went into the oratory all by myself to discern, to ask God, where are you leading me? And the first time I entered the room, there are chairs. I sat on the outside edge of the chairs. I just sort of moseyed my way in there. And the second time I came in, I made my way to the cushions a little bit closer. But all the time I was in the prayer room, I kept having the sense, draw near. In fact, I heard a voice that draw nearer to me. And so the third time I came into the prayer room, I knelt around the circle. And I drew closer, and I began to dig my hands into the gravel. And I would dig down, and I'd lift them up and let it filter through. And I would dig down again. It was like a child playing in the sandbox. And then it dawned on me. God is inviting me to bake bread. This is like the work of a baker mixing flour and kneading in a bowl. Now, the invitation that I received was part literal, though I did not leave parish ministry. But a year later, I built a wood-fired brick oven in our backyard so I could bake hearty, rustic loaves. And you can bake 12, 14 loaves of bread at a time in there. And that bread would freely get shared with neighbors and with parishioners. And then sometime later, the congregation where I served in White Bear Lake built a wood-fired community bread oven. We would make and bake bread together with people in the community. It was a beautiful, beautiful oven. We also started making pizza. And one thing we learned quickly, while Jesus fed the multitudes with bread, the multitudes really wanted pizza. The invitation was part literal, but also metaphorical. God was saying, do not look elsewhere to find your happiness. You will not find it in bigger or in better. God was saying, immerse yourself in the stuff of life, right where you live, right where you serve, for that is where you will find me. To be candid, I have spent much of my life looking elsewhere for my happiness. Wherever I was wasn't quite enough. Why? Because deep down, I didn't feel I was enough. Not good enough, not talented enough, not successful enough. I could never measure up to I don't know whose standard, but I didn't measure up. Earlier this evening, many of us gathered in, we received the bread and we received the cup. And I'm always grateful to receive those gifts. But the bread is grain from the fields. It's mixed with water and salt, maybe some yeast. The wine, fruit of the vine, harvested, then fermented. If these early earthy gifts are sacred, is it too far a stretch to say our ordinary lives are also of sacred worth? Our lives are more than enough. Richard Rohr, in his book Everything Belongs, I've been rereading this recently, he reflects on the mystery of the Eucharist, and then he muses, I always say it's easier for God to convince bread that it is the bread of life than to convince us. It's easier for God to convince wine it's the blood of Christ than us. But this is our identity, called and blessed to be the body and the blood of Christ. And that's what I'm slowly trying to absorb through reading, through retreats, through this practice called centering prayer. Here's how I start most mornings. I arise, make coffee for both of us, then toast bread that I have made, slather with just the right amount of butter. Then I serve Jody coffee and toast in bed. I mean, it's a good gig, right? But it's a good gig for me too. Then I sit down, sip my coffee, partake of the toast, read a morning devotion, and I set my timer for 20 minutes. As much as I enjoy the bread I have made, centering prayer has become my daily bread. Admittedly, I still feel like a novice after all these years, struggling with incursions of thoughts, difficulties letting go of the past, and fears of the future. But for a few moments in silence, I draw near to God, or is it God draws near to me? And there is a sense of being enough and being whole. Thank you.